بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وأهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
My name is Nurudeen Ali. I converted to Islam in 1989. So what's that, like 30 years ago? I converted just before my 17th birthday. I really went through maybe about a year of wandering. You know, I was raised as a Christian. My grandmother made sure that we went to church every Sunday. But as I got older, I had questions. Maybe when I was about 15, 16 years old, I started to question the Trinity and some of the incongruities that I saw in the religion. And none of my questions were ever answered to my satisfaction. So I started wandering spiritually, you know. And in the Caribbean, the official alternative religion is Rastafarianism. So Rastafari. So the first move I made from Christianity was to become a Rastaman. But, you know, Rastafarianism, really, I don't mean to disrespect any Rastas that might be tuned in this evening, but my interpretation of Rastafari was Christianity painted black. You know, God is black, his chosen people are black, and the white man is the bad guy. And so I didn't fit in there. So I continued to search and to seek, and I investigated Judaism and Buddhism and even Hinduism to a certain extent, but none of them grabbed me until I read a little bit about Islam and got introduced to Muslims in 9th grade. I was in 9th grade in high school, and I met a Muslim teacher, and she invited me to the masjid. And that's really where my studies of Islam really went in depth. And within 3 months, I had converted to Islam. Yep. So I converted to Islam. I was a Sunni at first, alhamdulillah. I spent a year, maybe about a year with our Sunni brothers. But, you know, the best people to do da'wah and tablighat for tashayyu is the Wahhabis. You know, I mean, they do a great job. And that's really what led me to the path of tashayyu. My interaction with Wahhabiyah and their virulent hatred of Shias really made me investigate tashayyu more and more, and made my eyes open to the realities of what tashayyu was saying versus what our Sunni brothers were saying, you know. So it was that type of a journey for me. Within a year, I became Shi'i, and when I finished high school, I went into Hawza Ilmiya. Yeah, I moved to New York. I went through the whole Medina, New York experience for 3-4 years, and then I went to Qom. I came back in the year 2000. I've been back ever since, alhamdulillah.
2 icebreaker questions. We just want to kind of open it up a little bit. What is your morning routine? What do you typically do in the mornings?
I'll get up for my Salat al-Fajr. On some days, I'm bold enough to stay up after the Fajr and start my day then. On other days, I'm not so successful. I go back to bed. I'm self-employed, so I don't really have a daily schedule these last few months. I get up, and if there's work to be done, I get up earlier and get my day started earlier. Otherwise, I sit around the house and read and write, or try to make work, try to find work, you know, like create work. Because, you know, you and I've had this discussion before, Sayyid, you know, we don't sit around and wait for a job. We create work, you know. So typical morning for me would include, you know, I need my Keurig machine. I need a cup of coffee in the morning, get the day started with the news, read the headlines, and then I get to work. I get to get out there and do whatever has to be done. Yep.
Absolutely. And the second icebreaker question is, tell me one funny story about when you went for Qom. You know, I know a lot of people, there's at least 1 or 2 crazy stories, and it's crazy to us, I think, because we haven't really experienced it. But I think to someone who's living in Iran, it's just everyday life. But
you know, it's interesting that you say that because I remember we had been in Qom maybe a couple days, maybe 2 or 3 days, and I mean, I wasn't very well liked by my teachers here in America because of the way I dressed or carried myself. Like I walked into Hausa classes in America with hair down on my shoulders, like way past my shoulders, like down on my stomach, you know. And my teacher told me, like, you got to cut your hair to come into this class. So I cut it back to my shoulders, and it still wasn't short enough, you know. I've always had trouble fitting in. So when I went to Iran, you know, of course, we went as Americans. And I'm from the Caribbean, so some of the clothes I was wearing was, you know, like a Caribbean style. So I had my jeans and my sneakers. And in the Caribbean, we wear a long red, gold, and green belt. You know, like the belt is way long, like way longer than a fat person could ever need. You know, and the remainder of the belt you leave hanging on the side.
Okay.
You know, you leave it hanging on the side. And I had my belt and a short sleeve shirt and my red, gold, and green belt hanging and my big jeans and everything. And short sleeve shirt. I remember the short sleeve shirt. And like out of nowhere, like every Iranian would stop me and tug on the belt, you know, like, what is this? You know, at the time I didn't know what they were saying. And they seemed like upset at me for walking around with this thing dangling. You know what I
Right.
mean? And everybody was on my case in Qom about the short sleeves, you know. So very quickly I just, you know, within a couple of days I wrapped up the belt and put it away. And I started wearing long sleeves, you know, because it was too much to bear. Like every seventh person would ask you where you're from, and you'd say America, and they'd say, well, what are you doing here? And you'd say, well, I came to study in the house. And immediately they'd look you up and down
They
and
do
be
the up
like,
and down, yeah.
yeah. They'd be like, yeah, right, buddy. So yeah, that would be one of my like earliest experiences, you know, with Iran and being an American fresh off the boat. Yep.
I think a lot of people who didn't have that, background as either like immigrants, their parents had immigrated here, or they had just never been to the Middle East. I think a lot of people had that same kind of situation. I had a friend who had the same situation. He was walking around with short sleeve shirts, which in the Hosa you don't do short sleeve shirts. That's like almost like walking around without a shirt. Like to the Taliban mind, it's like that's what they see. They see a man
Yeah.
with no shirt, walking around. So definitely, it's an adjustment, and I think it's an interesting thing. It's that culture shock that a lot of people have when they do go. Getting into the meat of the discussion. So the discussion was in regards to identity, and I just wanted to kind of begin by asking you this question: that when it comes to the Islamic perspective, how should we look at this question of identity? Are we a physical body? Are we a spiritual being? Because a lot of times this is the core of that discussion of what am I, right? Before we can get to who am I, we have to kind of come to that answer of what am I. So if you could, inshallah, answer this a little bit.
Yeah, certainly, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. You know, when we talk about this issue of identity, it's so multifaceted, right? We can't even approach the issue of identity from one particular side or from with one particular approach, because there's so many different sides to the issue of identity, you know. So like, just very quickly, if we look at it, we have that side of it that you're mentioning right now, right? Like that spiritual side of it, you know, that Islamic side of it. We have an identity that's given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, something that's conferred on us. And we'll talk about that. But just as an example, just to compare and contrast, we also have that identity, like, I don't know, like we inherit, you know, like we inherit an identity from our parents. You know, they name us, you know, first name and last name, you know, and we get a social security number, you know, we get an ID, we get birth certificate, right? And we have a mother and a father and a place that we're from, you know, so we have a certain identity that we inherit, right? And we're just speaking generally, right? And then we have another whole type of identity that we create for ourselves, right? Because X amount of our identity, you know, it's kind of created. We create it for ourselves. We kind of choose who we are, right? So because there's all these different sides to it, we got to start somewhere. And the best place to start is, as you've mentioned, like, what identity does Islam give us? Has Allah given us?
Mm.
And this is an important question, and I really wish, like, more people would meditate on this, like, think about this. Like, when, one thing that Hajj Agha says, Rahbar says, is that we should take a walk in the morning, like after our Salat al-Fajr. That itself is an ibadat, to go out and walk and take a break and think, right? That time of day is really special time of day. It's a great time of day to think about the position that Allah has given us. Allah says in the Quran, Karamna Bani Adam, that He honored Bani Adam. And so when we look at ourselves and we talk about the issue of identity, one thing we have to come to that immediate recognition of is that we have been given an identity by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's honored us. We're a very honored creation of His. He respects us. From another verse in Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He created us as khulafa. We're khalifatullah fil ardi. We're the representatives of Allah in the earth. And so this is another portion of our identity, right? This khilafat, right? And a lot of times when we say this word khilafat, then, temporal authority, governmental authority comes to mind, because that's the context that this word has taken on today, khilafat, right? But when we talk about khilafat in the sense that Allah has given us this identity of khilafat, it's much more broad and encompassing than simply, temporal, political, authority over the earth, as an example, right? Or in the earth. We're stewards. One could say that we're stewards in the earth. Or on another level, we could say that we represent Allah. Like in the Bible, they talk about man being made in the likeness of God, right? And what this reflects is that representation of God. And that's part of our identity too. Right. So when we talk about this identity, we have to root our identity first and foremost in the identity that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. Like that's what I would say about it,
I think part of losing touch with, with that real identity that we have as this spiritual being, as this creation of Allah, is that as soon as we begin to forget that aspect of it and we begin to really focus on, nationality, ethnicity, language, right, even sect, like all these little things that we've kind of created for ourselves, I think it becomes very easy to get disconnected from that actual, religious, that spiritual being that we are.
Yeah. And it's so easy to get disconnected from it, as you say, precisely because it's something that's immaterial. Like you can't touch it or experience it with your senses. So it takes a little more focus and work to really be in tune and in touch with that. And it's very easy to lose sight of that fact. That's why so many of the other things that we'll talk about with identity, like, can reinforce this aspect of identity, right? Like, for instance, we were just talking about clothing and how we dress and how different cultures look at clothing. And I remember in Iran, like, for a talabi to go out without socks was a problem too. Like, I don't know if you ran into that, but it wasn't just short sleeves, but for a man to be out in public, even without socks, was something kind of frowned upon, right? And when you look at Islamic tradition, A'imma advise us to wear clothes that cause us to be pious and humble. So even the clothes we wear can have an effect on how we express ourselves, our quote unquote, our identity, right? That's a part of our identity. So like all these things mix in together. It's funny too, right? Because in America, everything is kind of identity based too, right? Like from the start, right? It's a real race based society. Like in Iran, they have different races, different peoples, like you have Turks and Fars, you have Lur, Rashti, different ethnic groups, different languages, slightly different cultures, although they overlap to a great extent. right? But there are differences, but it doesn't seem quite as evil or pervasive as it is here. These differentiations that we have in America. So when we talk about this issue of who we are, especially from this aspect, like nationality and race and ethnicity, uh, cultural issues, right? Then all these things get mixed into that American pot. And part of it that comes up is exactly like you say, when we say, oh, we're not Americans, or don't be an American, like, we're warning them from these negative things that exist in our culture, right, as Americans. But I don't think there's any escaping it, to be honest with you. Allah says in the Quran that He created us on nations and on tribes, right? So to me, the way, like, don't take the Nurudeen tafsir on it, right? But when I read that verse, what I take from that portion of Surah Al-Hujurat is, yeah, it's perfectly natural and normal to have a nation and a tribe. Allah created us on a nation and a tribe. But the overreaching identity that we have is that identity that Allah has given us. These other things just add flavor. But to me now, being on a nation and a tribe is natural. And so, like, I think it's perfectly natural to be, as an example, right, a Pakistani American or Iranian American, right? And to identify with who we are as a people. That is absolutely fine. Or even now, as we as Americans now, where as the generations go by, we might not identify with Iran or Pakistan or Iraq or Lebanon anymore. We might identify more with America. And to me, there's nothing wrong with that, because that's our nation, right? That's the nation we were created on. Allah created us. He could have had us born in Iran or in Iraq or in Pakistan, but instead He had us born here. So this is the nation He created us on.
So, Sheikh Nurudeen, do you think parents are making a mistake? Because, a lot of parents, what they'll do is they will raise their kids as an Iranian, as an Iraqi, as an Afghan, and, almost like they're afraid of, what will happen if my child begins to adopt some of these aspects of American culture, not really realizing, right? Not really realizing that it's kind of a futile effort. They're not going to be successful, right? But a lot of parents do have this kind of idea where they're pushing back against anything which they see as American culture. And so the question is, do you think they're making a mistake? Is it possible that we could maybe ease into this process a little bit, make it a little bit easier for our kids to be Americans?
I mean, we definitely have to ease into this, right? Because, and I want to make this clear, right? I'm not one of those guys that, like, I want you to come here to America and, learn English or go home. You know what I'm saying? Conform, Now, I'm for diversity, and I understand when other people come from another country, they're not from here. They're not comfortable here. They see the bad here, right? And so therefore they want to protect themselves, and they want to protect their identity, because we're talking about identity, right? And so when they come here, they want to protect their identity. And a lot of what they do is based on defending and attempting to pass on that identity, right? And so from one point of view, there's really nothing wrong with that. But as you said now, when you try to, because the children are born here, raised here, when you try to push with them, to me, what it seems like it creates more often than not is a type of schizophrenia. And I know I'm using the term incorrectly, right? I'm not a trained professional, but we get to a place in our lives where we feel that we have to choose between this or that. Either I'm gonna be a good Muslim or I'm gonna be an American. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-aliyyil azim. Like, we get to a place where we have to choose, and I think that's unfair to our young people, because they are Americans.
One of the things that I've actually noticed is that what this causes is, a lot of times, it's almost like a dual personality. You were mentioning schizophrenia, that the individual at home, he's like a good, Desi child. He's a good Iranian child. And then as soon as he steps outside of that door, he becomes somebody completely different.
Yeah.
right? So you have this kind of, and I think it's a really unhealthy way to be, right? Where you're one person at home, and then as soon as you step outside, you're right, you're listening to different type of music, and
Walk
everything
different,
changes,
talk different.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can see it, right? And what I notice about the youth is the young people is they want to be comfortable. They don't want to live this double life like you're talking about.
Mm.
You know, they want to feel comfortable in their own skins. And we haven't done a good job of making them feel comfortable as Muslim Americans, you know? Yeah. Because there's a lot of positive things in America too. There's a lot of good things here too. Yeah.
So this question of, okay, so now we're kind of getting to this point that, okay, well, then we should be working on creating a very unique American Muslim identity, right? Something which combines Islam and it combines American culture and values into something which is unified. Yeah. So the only question here is, though, and this is kind of the war that is being fought out there. And we see this, we see it on social media, we see it amongst the next generation. Really, the question that is being asked by a lot of the youth is this question that, okay, well, what does this mean? What does it mean to be an American Muslim? Does it mean that I will adopt a number of American values, which are, for example, particularly liberal progressive? Or is it going to be an identity where I have an Islam that it retains its core values, but with an American twist? Right. And right now we're seeing this battle being fought that really a lot of
Yeah.
people are kind of saying, okay, well, no, it needs to be this, right? We have to soften some of the Islamic values, some of the Islamic teachings. We just have to. It's not compatible with American values. And then others are saying no, right? Others are saying no, absolutely not. You can combine the best of what we find in American culture, and you can also have a core foundation of Islam as well. So what would you say in regards to
The only way forward for us is to build this hybrid that you're talking about.
that?
Like, there's no other choice for us. We cannot hang on to where we came from
Mm.
because it doesn't serve us here. It's a very good identity. It's a positive identity. And we have to bring the best things of where we may be from to America, right? And that's a good thing, that part of that identity. But we have to realize also that that culture and that approach can't work here. And like Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam said, raise your children for their time, not your time. You know, we're raising our children, a lot of times our immigrant families are raising our children for their own time, not for their children's time. You know what I'm saying? So we have to build this hybrid. The only way forward is to build this hybrid, this Muslim American culture. And in my personal opinion, this is the culture that will spread Islam to the rest of the world. Like, because we're becoming inoculated, all this talk now about vaccines in the news media, right?
Mm.
We're becoming vaccinated against the evils of this society, right? By building what we're building here. We're becoming immunized. We can spread this immunity to the rest of the world by building this culture that you're talking about. Yeah, I don't know, like, how else to say it. We have to build this because there's positive things in American culture. Like, if you go down and, like, if you do a Google search of the top 10 American values, like American cultural values, you'll see that, I mean, Islam is more an American faith, more geared towards that American values than Christianity is. Like one American value, as an example, and we learn it from we're children, right? Is we pay our own way.
Mm.
I mean, from children we learn that in America, like you got to do for self. Like, we're like one of the few places in the world where when our kids hit their late teens, we try to make them move out, like, go get a job and get a place and start your life. Like, we're rough when you compare the way we deal with our kids in America compared to the rest of the world. Some people say we spoil them. I think we do spoil them, and we also have some aspects in our culture where we're kind of tough.
Mm.
Like we expect the 18, 19, 20-year-olds to like be out there doing it, like have your own place and your car and your everything. You know what I'm saying?
Mm.
So we're kind of tough when it comes to that. But one of our values is that we pay our own way. You know, this is an Islamic value. You know, even
Without a
spiritually,
doubt.
we. If I commit a sin, I pay for it. You know, in Christianity, someone else pays the bill.
Mm.
You know,
I think the main issue that people are kind of facing with this is that they're looking at things that are being promoted today. And what's interesting is a lot of these things were not in existence, for example, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. But they're looking at things like homosexuality. They're looking at things like the promotion of abortion. They're looking at all of these negative things, which, interestingly enough, they actually go against a lot of those core American values of, for example, 50, 60, 70 years ago, right? And so they're looking at this stuff and they see it as just, one complete package that I can't take the good and leave the bad. It's just all going to come and it's going to destroy my children and my progeny. And so I think it's really important here that we recognize that we're going to have to take the good while definitely separating and leaving the negatives, which Islam very clearly has a position on. And I think in order to do that, we have to have very strong Islamic foundations.
yeah,
And
strong institutions with that
yeah,
vision to see the future, to see what we're building. But
absolutely.
at the same time too, when we talk about this intersection between the cultural values that we have in America and the changes that are happening, it's not just we as Muslims and our own children that are facing many of these challenges. And one thing I'd like to point out, and I mean, a lot of us know it already, right? That this same battle is going on in American households,
Mm.
And maybe in California, the progressives have won the day, right? But I'm here to tell you, in the rest of America, the battle is not won, Yeah, the war is not won. Battles are ongoing. And you have a majority of Americans who have not given up on their values, but they're silent. And so you bring up certain issues that are progressive issues that are going on now, gender issues and LGBTQ issues and these issues, right? I'm willing to venture that a vast majority of Americans are just as uncomfortable with these changes as we are.
Mm.
However, it's culturally inappropriate to speak out. You can get a big beatdown. You can lose your business. You can lose everything if you speak out. And so people are keeping quiet, and they're just saying, look, which is another American value, by the way, which in my view is a good thing. Look, as long as I can't see it from my backyard, like you're free to do what you want to do as long as I'm free to do what I want to do. And so a lot of the people are taking that approach to it, but it doesn't mean they like it or that they're in favor of it. So I'd like to point that the same battle is going on in American households. We're not unique in this regard.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at Christians, if you look at Jews, if you look at any major religion, they're having the same fight. They're having the same struggles. And part of, it's an interesting dynamic that, it's almost like when we talk about shaitan, we talk about a being who tends to use illusion to fool people, right? So he'll create the illusion. He'll bring about the fear of, for example, poverty, as the Quran mentions. He will bring the illusion of missing out on opportunities, missing out on pleasures. And so that's how he tends to work. He tends to work through illusion. And when we look at the way that, all of this is going, it's primarily being driven through the power of social media, right? And we almost get this feeling that it's everywhere, right? Every movie that we watch, there is, for example, homosexuality and these kinds of
Every
values.
show, every
Show,
movie.
without
Yes.
any exception, right?
That's right.
If there's 5 characters, 2 of them are going to be from the LGBTQ.
My kids were watching a vampire show the other day, okay? And they had a gay vampire in it. And that just, that gets me. Because look, we got to draw lines, not vampires. Come on, man. I don't know. Go ahead, say it. I'm sorry.
I mean, at least leave the vampires alone, right? Like, let them be with
come on, man. Really? Them two?
But I mean, absolutely, it's being pushed through, right, through all of this media. And so a lot of times, I think us included, we get this idea that it's very prevalent. But then when you actually look at the stats, you realize, wait a minute, only like 1 to 2 to 3% of the US population actually practices these kinds of cultures or these kinds of lifestyles. So, in fact, it is extremely uncommon. It's something that is, if you're going throughout your day, you're really not going to come across any of this stuff in your day to day life. But they've created this illusion that it is something that is very common and very pervasive. And I think that's part of the game, and that's part of the trick, is that we need to realize that this is an illusion. It's not real life.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up that approach to it, right? Because I think a lot of us use this approach also when we're confronted with difficulties in our religion, as an example, right? You see, I think that what's going on is, if you make it seem okay, like if you justify it and normalize it, right, then there's no outcry. What's wrong with you? This is normal. So if you normalize it and justify it, then this deadens the outcry. Like, even if we look at ourselves with sin as an example, disobedience to Allah, if I do something and justify it, make my haram a halal, make what's forbidden for me allowed, make what's bad for me good, make what's whatever unnatural natural, right? So what I've done now is convince myself, and I've removed that little piece of guilt that might come with that, right? This is worse than doing the same thing, but at least you feel guilty about it. Don't justify it. Say, I'm doing this and it's wrong. Don't try to justify it. Don't try to, normalize it. I'm doing this, it's wrong, right? Like, this is a better position, even though they're both doing the same thing, right? So what I think's going on is, like, they're trying to normalize this thing, make it seem like it's just ordinary, so that no one speaks up, no one says anything. And it's not just one particular issue, it's a broad agenda. It's not just this issue or that issue. It's not just gender, LGBTQ, or gay rights. It's a whole swath of things that's going on.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting things that goes back to our sense of identity as belonging to this country, belonging in this country. A lot of times when I see the next generation, they are falling into this trap of saying, you know what, we support LGBTQ rights. We support, for example, abortion. We support this and that. A lot of it, I feel, is coming from this place where you feel that you're not a real American. And so in order to be accepted by everyone else, then you have to accept these things which are being put on the agenda.
Well, you see, and this is what I hate about what's going on in America right now, because this is very un-American. Like, when we talk about positive things in American culture, one of the positive things that we have in American culture is the right to disagree. And I think that that's being squashed now by these progressives and these liberals. There was a time in America when I was free to say no. There was a time in America when I was free to say I don't agree. There was a time when I could say I think it's wrong. Whatever the case may be. Now you come and you say that, like, when our young people go to the universities, as an example, if they should speak up outside of that liberal progressive line that's taught at the universities, they're ridiculed and ostracized and beaten down. Like, whatever happened to, like, America? Freedom of speech, freedom of discourse, the right to disagree, like, we don't even have that anymore. I don't even get it. This is a good thing in America, and it's being killed.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a type of Cold War, a type of soft war that's taking place. But, let me redirect and ask you this question then. What do we do for American celebrations? Because this was a question that was asked, is, okay, we have all of these American celebrations, okay, and they go from semi-religious, such as Christmas, right, to kind of pagan Halloween, to more less religious, more, for example, just American based, to Thanksgiving. So there's a lot of issues here where some people are saying, hey, we should be celebrating these. For example, Christmas is the birth of Jesus, so I'm going to put up a Christmas tree, I'm going to do all of that, and this is a part of being a American. Others are saying, no, no, these things actually are going against Islam. I just wanted to take your see what your take on this was.
I've got a kind of a loose approach when it comes to American holidays.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it comes to religious holidays, I think we need to be on guard. And the reason I say that is more so because of the weakness that we as Muslims have, right? I'm gonna point out myself first. We don't celebrate our holidays like a holiday. Like, for instance, today was Eid, right? Like, what did we do to make it Eid?
Mm.
Like any of us who's in the audience, what did we do to today to make it Eid? I went to work. I went and did a job today. So we don't really celebrate our own holidays like a big shebang. And we can get sucked into celebrating their big shebangs because it's convenient culturally. We're off, they're off, right? So it's very easy to get sucked into that big shebang that they've got going on. So I would say, like, as we forge ahead and try to create this identity as Muslim Americans, then I would say, like, the religious holidays, let's celebrate our own religious holidays big and let them celebrate their religious holidays, Now, the other holidays, and I know I'm going to upset a lot of my fellow Americans, right? But, like, for instance, I like Thanksgiving. And I know a lot of our American brothers and sisters now are getting on the thing that, it's the day that the white people killed the Indians and took all their food and, this type of stuff. And that did happen. And that is true. But what is it? That last Thursday of November, when that rolls around, even if I don't associate with the Pilgrims or the Indians, I'm still going to have turkey and cranberry sauce and mashed potatoes and, baked macaroni, all that, So we have to accept some of these things as our culture. Like, I'm down with some of these. Like, some of them we got to let in. We can't say no to everybody. I think my feeling on Halloween. Halloween is istinqaz mali. You got to go out there and collect as much free candy, Bismillah, as much as you can. It's one way to weaken the system, one candy bar at a time. So, I mean, like, Halloween I support because I got sick of my kids always wanting a costume, always wanting to go out. And it's not the same to buy them a costume and get them candy. They still want to go out with their little friends and their little buddies. So we gave in, years ago on stuff like Halloween. And I know a lot of people are going to give me a lot of flack about that.
It comes down to this idea of what is really the message of what we're doing by celebrating these things. So, for example, if we are being weak in regards to our own for Eid al-Adha or Eid al-Fitr, and we're not really doing that much, and then, for example, for the Christmas celebration, we go and we buy a Christmas tree, right? There is definitely this idea in our children's minds that this is more important, and obviously they're going to be seeing, alongside what we're doing, they're going to be seeing all of this other stuff in the society taking place. So instantly in their minds, they're going to recognize Christmas, which is a non-Islamic holiday, is more important and has more value than, for example, Eid al-Adha.
Yeah.
Right? So that could have.
And even if we don't go and get the Christmas tree, let's just say we don't go and get the Christmas tree, but we don't celebrate our own holiday big, right? Just looking around, they can see that Christmas is a big deal, that Easter is a big deal. They don't look around and see Eid as a big. Now, I used to fool my kids. You know what I'm saying? Like, when Christmas came around, it was like in Ramadan time, they'd be like, Baba, what are all the lights for? I'd be like, it's for Ramadan. Or when I remember something was going on in Muharram time, and I was like, it's for Imam Hussein. You know what I'm saying? Like, but you can't misdirect them like that forever.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And just in the culture, they're going to look around and see that these things are powerful. So we have to confront power with power, strength with strength, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's coming down to this point where we're seeing that there's such inferiority complex that really a lot of Muslims are saying, you know what, forget about these Islamic holidays. You know, they're good, right? They're in their own place, but they're definitely putting more focus on these un-Islamic holidays. And the kids really, when we talk about identity, that's one of the biggest things. I remember there was a hadith that I was reading a while back, and essentially Imam Jafar as-Sadiq alayhi salam, he was telling that, for the Muslims, when it comes to the day of Friday, go and, for example, buy some fruit, wear some new clothes, make it seem as if it's a special occasion for your family members, for your wife, for your kids, so that for those kids that are growing up, they will associate that day of Friday, that Yawm al-Jum'ah, with something special.
Yeah.
And so really, this is really powerful, that when we're dealing with kids that are 4 years old, 5 years old, 7, 10, 14, whatever it is, that power of association is really integral in what they become and who they become later on.
It is.
Yeah.
And we've really overlooked that.
Mhm.
Like, genuinely overlooked that. And we have to amend that, like, as soon as possible, because we can't even wait till they're 14. We can't even really wait till they're 8, 9, 10. When they're these things that you're talking about, you do that with them when they're little, and it takes hold, and they never forget Friday. You know? Yeah, it's very important that we celebrate our own holidays and give importance to our own days. Like, keep our kids home from school. Let them get the day off from school, even if it's not a given day off or whatever. Like, make it a good big day for them. It's very important.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we can't say no for everything either, because this culture, our people have to learn how to be comfortable as themselves, and they've grown up on Thanksgiving. They've grown up on, football. They've grown up on all the things that are associated with these holidays, the candy sales on the day after Halloween, all that stuff. So,
segueing into something which is related as well, is when it comes to forging a sense of identity. This reminded me of, the idea of clothing during the time of the Holy Prophet. It's interesting. We kind of look at clothing as just something that you put on. We don't really give it that much thought. But when you look at Islamic history, the Holy Prophet, he had this whole plan for forging a Muslim identity during that time period. And he did it in a lot of interesting ways. There was a lot of different aspects to this. But one of the things that he did was he recognizes that the way that you look is really integral in who you feel that you are and that sense of identity that you establish for yourself. And so, for example, when we look at the history of the Holy Prophet, one of the things that he begins to tell the Muslims as more and more convert to Islam, he begins to tell them that, for example, I want you to dress in slightly different ways from the kuffar. Right? So you have the Muslims as a very small community. You have the non-Muslims, which is the vast majority of the city. And he's telling you, okay, for example, when you wrap your turbans, I want you to wrap it in this slightly different way. Right? When you wear for example, the kufi, the hat underneath the turban, I want you to wear it in this way. Right? Your clothing, make sure that it's not too long. I want you to shorten it a little bit so that you don't resemble the disbelievers. Your beards, for example, even when it comes to the style of the beards, he was telling them that I want you to cut the mustache short and allow the beard to grow out. Why? Because it was a custom at that time for the non-Muslims. They would let the mustache grow all the way out and they would cut their beards short. So in every respect, we see this. The Holy Prophet, he's basically saying, look, I want you to look different somehow so that when people see you, they say, these are the followers of Muhammad. And it's interesting because we see the same thing when we look at today's world. I was looking at this idea of prison clothing. Inshallah, no one has been to prison. I haven't personally been to prison either, but I've looked into it, that what do they do in the prison system? And one of the things that they do, which is really interesting, is that they will take the clothes that you were wearing when you first entered into that prison, and they will take those and then they will give you prison clothing. And one of the reasons this is all thought out, this is all planned, it's not just by accident that, they don't want you wearing your own pair of Nikes or whatever. What they're really doing is they're trying to break down your sense of individual identity, and they're trying to break you down so that you understand that now I'm a prisoner. I answer by my number, for example. I don't answer by my name. I have these very ill, loose-fitting clothes that looks exactly like every single other person here. And again, we see this in the military. We see this in, different aspects of life. Clothing has a really integral a role that it plays in the sense of identity that we build up for ourselves. So what do you think we could be doing as Muslims? Should we just be saying, hey, this is a lost cause? Should we be slightly dressing in different ways so that we can be identified as Muslims? What's your take on this?
I think that there is a Muslim clothing culture
Mm.
developing in America, right? And we might not see it as such. We might not recognize what's going on, but there is. For instance, the kufi you have on,
Mm.
this is something that not many other people around the world wear. Like, I mean, people don't wear, and specifically this particular style, this is something that's almost uniquely American Muslim.
Mm.
This style of, like, you don't find it on sale in Iran or in Iraq or anywhere else. They don't even wear that. Like, to wear that, then it signifies that you're not from there if you're wearing that. So this type of kufi also is something. You see, American Muslims have always worn, or pretty much worn, clothes similar to what the rest of the culture does, but it will be differentiated in some way. For the females, that they'll conform to the hijab. And the males, I also encourage the brothers, as much as is possible, to identify themselves, usually through headgear
Mm.
or a t-shirt or something, some way, somehow, to identify themselves as Muslims. Like, to me, the beard is good, but these days everybody's got a beard. So you need to stick out a little bit more. So I encourage people to wear stuff in public to identify themselves as Muslim. But we are working on that. We are seeing that develop amongst Muslims.
It's fascinating to me that when you wear a piece of clothing, how much effect it has. A lot of times we don't really think about it, that clothing really, it makes you feel a certain way. It makes you think a certain way. Even your behavior,
Yeah,
the way that you're going to act in public.
yeah,
If you can be identified as a Muslim, right? If you're wearing a kufi, it's less likely that you're going to engage in certain types of behaviors. You
it's
might,
true.
even your jokes, right? There's certain jokes that you're saying, you know what? I'm wearing a kufi. I'm not going to go there, right?
That's right.
In front of non-Muslims. And I think we don't really realize just how much of an effect it has. But if we think back, when you wear a suit, how do you feel?
Yeah.
There's a certain feeling. There's a certain type of
You
behavior.
walk differently, don't you?
Absolutely, absolutely. You walk as if you are a certain type of person, and so I think we're kind of shortchanging ourselves in this respect, that we're trying to blend in. We're trying to say I'm just like everyone else, and there's a lot of benefits in this of really dressing distinctly, dressing separately as Muslims.
And I think that here's another thing that we can, since we're talking about identity,
Mm.
and we're really trying to reconcile these two parallel identities that exist within many of us, right? Here is another American value that's on the decline. Truly American value that really differentiates us from other cultures around the world. There was a time in America where it was perfectly okay to be different. Like, if you wanted to go outside with a crazy hat on, look out, because it was so different. That crazy hat might catch on. There was a time when you could be different, and being different was okay. And I'm not trying to, like, glorify some particular past in America, but one of our values is that it's okay to be you. And this doesn't exist in other countries, right? In other countries, you have to submit to who we say you are. Your neighbors look at you funny if you don't conform. Here in America, nobody gives a darn, because you can be you.
Mm.
At least that's the way it's supposed to be. And yet we find our youth giving up on their own individual, unique identity and trying to conform and melt in and blend in with what's going on. And it's the same for all the youth. Like, it's not just Muslim youth. Like, Even when we were kids, everybody wanted to wear the same type of shoes or the same brand of pants or had the same type of stuff, right? And when we look back, the cool guy was the guy that was ahead of the curve, the guy that didn't do what everybody else was doing, you know? And here we are now actively trying to do and blend in with everybody else, when our beauty, our strength is in our unique individuality. You know, so it's like amazing to me when our youth have something so precious and so beautiful, so unique, and they're actively trying to blend in. Like, you're dumbing yourself down. You know, I don't know.
You know, one of the interesting things I was reading about a while back was what these companies do. So, for example, Nike, Adidas, you know, these kind of companies that are looking for the next big style. What they do is they actually will send representatives out into the poorer neighborhoods. So they'll send people out into the ghettos and they're trying to find the next big trend before it gets big so they can capitalize on it. And it's just really interesting that, you know, they're looking at it from that perspective. They're actually trying to find, okay, let's go into the poorest areas of the United States. Let's find out what is becoming popular and let's capitalize on that before we miss out. And so, you know, we're kind of thinking the opposite. We're thinking, okay, how do I blend in? How do I look like everyone else? So it's an interesting difference that I've seen between these two things.
Yeah, yeah. That those who are in power recognize the power of that uniqueness, right? And those of us who are subjected to their power, we want to blend in. We don't want to take advantage of that power of being unique, you know, and asserting our own unique American Muslim identity, right? So it's like amazing to me. Like, if our youth, like, I'd love to like take some of these young people sometimes and just like, we need to take them out with us, Sayyid, and hang out with us, because some of the interactions that I have with people, I'd like to grab these young people and say, look at this, man. Is this what you're trying to blend in with? You know?
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing, dude?
Do you think, you know, it kind of, a thought occurred to me that, is it possible though to take things too far? You know, one just thing that came to mind is, you know, so every country is going to be different, right? In some cases, women will wear hijab, and especially when it comes to converts or when it comes to certain demographics, they're going to say, you know what, I want to wear the niqab as well, right? Or for example, you have the example of the convert who says, okay, well, you know, I've become a Muslim, you know, Caucasian American background. I've become a convert, and now I'm going to start dressing up in like shalwar kameez and kufi, and to them, that's Islamic culture. What's your take on this? I don't know if you've even yourself you've gone through this kind of a phase.
You know, I didn't really go through that phase so much so per se, right? I did have my little eccentricities. Like when I first became Muslim, I didn't really get into the clothing so much so as I really got into the food, you know? So like, I started drinking my coffee, you know, Turkish style, you know what I'm saying? And you know, I started eating more Mediterranean and Eastern type foods. So I got into that whole aspect of it from one point of view. But I have seen what you're talking about. And I think that there is something to be said about, quote unquote, going too far, right? Because I've seen brothers and sisters convert to Islam. Now, as far as the niqab and the sisters, I think that is completely a sister's choice. We should make it clear that the niqab is not mandatory in Islam. But moving right along, that's somebody's own choice. Because me, if I was a woman, I might wear it, not wear it. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's an excellent disguise. You could move around. You can see, nobody can see you. It's just fantastic. But
well, you know, I think it's mandatory now, right? It's wajib now. So everyone is going to have to wear the niqab anyway.
Everybody got a niqab on now. But so that's the niqab. Yeah. As far as a lot of the other aspects, like I've seen people convert to Islam and like pick up an accent, you know, like Cats born and raised here, now they're speaking with an accent, or
Yeah.
they're walking around with the miswak in their mouth all the time. Like, do you walk around with do you think Prophet walked around all day long with his toothbrush in his mouth? You know, like come on, guys. Or the guy that becomes, I told you this one, I think, once, where we had this brother that he used to always wear shalwar kameez, African American brother, converted to Islam, and he used to always wear the shalwar kameez. And he comes to masjid one day and he says, "Man, I can't find work anywhere. I'm looking for a job and I can't find a job." And I'm like, "Yeah, well, did you go to your interview dressed like this?" He was like, "Yeah." I was like, "Well, no wonder you can't find work. You're dressed like an illegal alien. I mean, nobody's gonna hire you like that." So I do think that sometimes we go too, like, when we convert, in that rejection of that identity that we had, we can go too far, and so we reject everything. And I think a part of that remains even with some of members of our community to this day. Like, I'm surprised when I see Americans who are like, "I want to get out of the country and go live somewhere else," like, and they've never been anywhere else or lived anywhere else. Like, "I'm gonna go to Africa and live in Africa," or "I'm gonna move to a Muslim country and live in a Muslim country." Yeah, buddy, go ahead, do that. Most of them are gonna come home.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, let's just be honest. Why, though? Because as much as you hate to admit it, you are an American. And when you go there, even if you're black and you're in Africa, you will always be the American. And
One of the things that they would always tell me is that, people would pick up on small cues. And it took me a couple of years until I was able to blend in. But, I'm ethnically Iranian. So for me, it was much easier. But even in my case, I could speak Farsi fluently, even when I first got there. They would pick up on little cues, and people would tell me, "You walk different. You're the way that you talk, right? The flow of your words is a little bit different." And so they would pick up on these little cues. And so even if I stayed in Iran, let's say I did move back and I stayed there for 40, 50 years, I would still be, for example, Sayyid Ali, the American, right? American,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's not going to change.
As Iranian, your mommy's Iranian, your dad's, your grandparents are Iranian.
Yeah.
English might be a second language to you. You probably
it is, yeah.
spoke Farsi at home when you were a kid. But you will always be an American when you go to Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is one thing that we fail to recognize, how deep our attachment is to this culture and to this country. It goes right back to Allah saying He created us on this.
So, Shaykh, I wanted to continue right now on marriage issues. Many parents, they oppose their children marrying people of other ethnicities, right? Especially converts, which I'm sure you've seen that, that side of things.
Oh, I've experienced it. Oh yeah, man. When I first wanted to get married, right, I was about 21 years old. I was in the madrasa in Medina, New York. And I was like, "Man, I'm going to get married. I'm a Hosa student. I got something to offer."
You're royalty, right?
Yeah. I mean, who wouldn't want a Hosa student for a son-in-law? Man, I went to the Iraqis. I went to the Pakistanis. Man, they shot me down. Boom, boom, boom. I mean, one of the things they actually said was, you converted to Islam. What'll you convert to next? So yeah.
From the perspective of the parents, so I'm going to try to play devil's advocate. I have my own perspective on this issue, but from the perspective of the parents, they're going to say something that sounds very reasonable, very logical, and they're going to say, "Look, there is an issue of compatibility. That if my child is Indo-Pak, if he's Iranian, if he's Iraqi, right, if he's from these kinds of places, then he's going to be more compatible culturally with somebody who is from that same background." So it sounds like a reasonable thing. It's a very common thing which is said. What's your take on this?
It's a deep issue. So I'm going to rock the boat here, Sayyid. And I'm going to say that, so just to say something shocking and outlandish to begin with, from one point of view, I agree with those parents. Yani, me, as a convert who has now my own born Muslim kids, if they come to me with a convert, we're going to look carefully. We may look, and it's wrong to do that. but we may look more carefully at that convert than we may at somebody else. And I'll get into that in a minute, right? Like why that is, even for me as a convert, because there's a deep issue behind it that actually goes back to Deen, and we'll talk about that. Goes back
But
to
what about,
religion.
let's leave the converts, and what
Yeah,
about just for ethnicity, right? So you have Iranian
exactly.
or
Yeah, we want to
Indian.
start there.
Yeah.
We want to start there where we see that a lot of times our parents are encouraging us to get married to or within the same ethnicity or same nationality, same cultural background. And the argument that they use, as you were saying, which seems entirely logical and reasonable, you are an Iraqi, you are an Iranian, you are a Pakistani, you will be more comfortable with someone who is the same, culturally the same. That same argument can be used to say you are an American.
Mm.
And you would be way more comfortable with an American than you would be with an Iraqi or a Pakistani or an Iranian. So this argument itself, just in and of itself, doesn't really hold much water. We definitely want our kids, when they find a spouse, to be matched, not just culturally, but also religiously and spiritually. And I think that this is something that while we say that we pay attention to it, right, and while we put it high on our list of to-dos when we're looking for a spouse, very seldom do we really and actually follow through on it. And I'm speaking like from experience here. We say that we want to make a choice based on religion, and sometimes we may even do that. But in all honesty, there are other factors that we put before that. Ethnicity and cultural background and economics are some of those things.
I mean, from the hadith perspective, right? Compatibility is definitely a real issue, right? That
it's a
we
real
have
issue.
hadith on this, that when you are, trying to get married, look for compatibility, look for someone that is socially, like economically to some degree, right? They need to be they need to be someone who's compatible with you, right? That when you bring them to your house, the lifestyle that you lead is going to be something that they're used to, they're comfortable to, right? If you, for example, marry a princess, right, that's going to lead to some issues, right? If you bring him to the house of a pauper. Yeah. Cinderella aside and all those movies aside.
No, certainly that there is some value in the guidance that Islam provides, that it says, you look for somebody that you're evenly yoked, as we say in English, But what does that mean? I mean, because I'm going to just throw it out here, right? We have a lot of our second generation, whether they be immigrants, children who were born and raised here, or my own children, right? Because I'm going to be honest with you, my own children have more in common with you, as a second generation Iranian, first generation American, born and raised here, right? So they have more in common with you than they do actually with me. Even though we're all Americans and I'm their dad, because they've been raised in a Muslim household, whereas I wasn't and you were. You know what I'm saying? So there's certain differences that come into play here. But what does it mean when we say evenly yoked? Because when we look at our youth, we see that a lot of times their relationships are rocky or ending, or they're getting divorced, and it's because they're not evenly yoked. And this isn't just about economics, it can be about culture too. I think that a lot of times we would do well to look outside of our ethnic group when we're looking for a spouse. Like I've spoken to a lot of brothers and sisters that are looking for a spouse, and amazingly, the sisters are more willing to look outside of their ethnic group than the brothers are. right? And one thing I face is like they say, well, I can't find a spouse, an Iranian spouse or a Pakistani spouse or an Arab spouse, right? So I always come with, well, why don't you marry an American, you know? And I found many times that people are very reluctant to marry, even a born Muslim American, because they feel that they'd be different or my family wouldn't accept them. But the young people have more in common with them than they do with the bride or the groom that they may bring from overseas.
I mean, I've really been seeing this actually in some communities, particularly Iraqi communities, but also Iranian, Indo-Pak. What there's a tendency to do is that they can't find people here, so they're actually uh, bringing people. They're usually their relatives, right,
Yeah,
cousins and whatnot, and they're bringing them from, for example, straight from Basra to San Diego,
yeah.
and they are wedding, for example, this individual to their daughters, and in a lot of cases, it's leading to a lot of issues because these are completely different cultures. They look at their kids that, okay, well, my child is, speaks Arabic, it has the same culture as I do, without realizing that these are two very radically different cultures with radically different expectations that each person has of not just what they, the life that they want to live, but also the life or the type of behavior they want from their spouse. And so we're kind of seeing this, and it's ending in disaster. A lot of these cases are ending up in divorce.
I mean, one thing we have to realize too, like we're trying to say here, is that they're not evenly yoked. To use the example you mentioned, you're bringing somebody from back home, never set foot in America, to come and marry someone who may be culturally American, maybe not completely, but to a great extent, and a whole new culture, a whole nother person. Wow, it can go bad in so many different ways. And it's because we're not really looking at all the options that before us. And when we talk about building this hybrid that we're talking about, this Muslim American culture, part of it is going to come about through these intermarriages. We are still two separate tribes, living as one people. To use that Quranic verse that we mentioned in the beginning, right? And there's not much mixing between us. Like, it's amazing when you find, it's not so uncommon to find a immigrant man married to an American woman, right? Vice versa is very uncommon. To find like a Pakistani woman married to a black man, or an Iranian woman married to a white man, or whatever the case may be. Like this portion of the relationship, like the immigrant community don't give us their daughters much. They're more than willing to take ours, but they don't give us their daughters too much. This culture that we're talking about, though, this is one of the ways it's going to be built is through this interaction, because in building this American identity, right, we're going to take a piece from here and a piece from there and mix it. And part of it is in this marriage. And so when we look for a spouse, we have to, I think a lot of us are still living in Iraq or Pakistan or Iran in the back of our mind. Like, some way, somehow, we still expect to go home one day, and we have to get to a place where we realize that we're here now. This is our home. This is our children's home, right? And we have to look for a spouse for them based on, they are not going home. They're not going to become more Iraqi here, so we have to plan for their time.
Yeah, absolutely. Another topic that was kind of interest, and I know we're getting towards the end of our time. We don't have much time. Oh, actually, we do have a question. Let me get into this question. What about the in-laws? So does that factor in? Is that going to be an issue that, okay, let's say that the two people are fine, but the parents are not okay with it?
I mean,
What have
I've
you
seen
seen in
that
your
happen
experience?
so many times. I've seen that happen so many times where parents are dead set against the marriage because the person is a convert or the person is not from their ethnicity. I've even seen it where the people are essentially the same people ethnically, right? But one is a convert and the other person, their people converted maybe 200 years ago, but their family don't want them to marry to each other. This happens very frequently where the in-laws get involved and can actually wreak a lot of havoc. I've seldom seen it where the in-laws are involved, the mothers and fathers are involved, like ala haq, on the
Mm,
right, and they're really making a good decision for their child. I've rarely seen that. Most of the time, they're in there making fitna. So, keeping two people that would be a good match away from each other. I mean, just within the last few weeks, we dealt with a case like this in Detroit. And if that couple is watching, then they know who they are. They had this brother had to go and pick his wife up and, for all intents and purposes, steal her, you know, so that the father could then show up and sign the paperwork and give the consent. Bubba, you knew you were gonna do it. He's a good man anyway, but sometimes it takes that, and most of the times that I've seen, the in-laws are in the way. And this happens also not just when they're getting married, but it can happen also after they get married, like when the couple are living together. And one thing that our young people have to realize is that you have to love and obey and respect your parents, but it's very difficult to change gears. Like, I know this is going to sound absolutely radical, will upset a few people in the audience, but an old wise man told me this when I was a young man and first got married. He said, now that you're newly married, don't let your wife go see her mother too much for a little while. Like, have her stay with you, like she's going to want to go back and visit home. You say, nah, stay with me. Bring the parents to visit you, but you do your best not to send her home for any length of time,
mm.
because changing gears between daughter and wife, can be difficult. Changing gears between son and husband to actually stand up to your parents, and I'm saying this like in the wrong terms maybe, but in defense of your wife when you're in son mode is difficult, you know? So what we want to do is really encourage our young people to love and to respect and honor their parents, but they have to also build their own relationships, you know? And when they see that negativity coming in, they have to be on their guard, like after they're married.
I think there's a very fine line, and Islam is all a fine line. I mean, every
Mm,
teaching in Islam has one extreme and,
balance.
and the other extreme, and Islam is right there in the middle. And I think people, they need to recognize that respect of parents is absolutely wajib. Love of parents, obedience to parents is absolutely wajib. But there is a limit to it, right? It isn't that they control your entire life, and there are places and times where you need to make your own choices. And again, you take everyone's opinions into consideration, because they do have a lot of experience. In a lot of cases, I've seen that young people are wrong. They have certain
Yeah.
ideas that are wrong. So
Especially in these cases, like when we're
mm,
talking about affairs of the, because we're talking about marriage,
yeah.
and when we're talking about affairs of the heart, these are primal urges that human beings have. Like, you can't contest with them, right? And in these issues, our young people, especially, we want to advise them to take as much advice from those who love them and can guide them in making the proper choices, because all too often, what's happening now, say, I know I'm taking it off track a little bit. If we
Uh-huh.
run over, forgive me. I've got all night. It's no problem. So let's run it. But real quick, a lot of times we make emotional attachments before we move to like make a formal relationship. So I'm talking to the girl for a while, right? And there's an emotional attachment that's created there before we ever go to daddy, before we ever
Mhm.
talk about marriage. And so now I've made this emotional connection, for better or worse. you know and now later on, it might be a parent that can come and say, look out, be careful,
Mhm.
look at this, look at that, pay attention to this. But because we've already, quote unquote, fallen in love, right? And we can make poor decisions. So our young people really have to be open to taking advice in this regard. It's so important. And I just wanted to emphasize that,
Absolutely.
especially in this regard. Like, You know, you might blow your parents off for other stuff. Wear a helmet when you ride your bike. You know, don't forget your knee pads, you know, whatever. But in this issue, you want to listen to them,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, even in those issues, I learned the hard way they were right.
Yeah, I've got a few stitches to prove it too.
But with this in mind, right? Keeping this, that the elders, they really do have a lot of experience, and they have, the best intentions. There are times I've seen as well. So again, it's a very balanced. We have to be very balanced. We have to be very careful that in some cases they're wrong. And when they're wrong, we also have to, recognize that. And we also have to, again, dealing very gently, not going
Love them.
past those limits that Islam has set for us, but, dealing with that issue and actually forging a path forward. Because sometimes I've seen cases where uh, people, they took the easy way out. They said, well, it's my parents' wishes, and,
Yeah.
they remained unmarried, or they married somebody else and it ended in disaster.
Oh,
Right?
man. And like people don't dig this. Like when you're saying you're getting married, right? And you're a Muslim and you're trying to get married to protect your deen and to be religious, right? And you pass over an opportunity, yani a good opportunity, for no good reason, you lose that. But to get that back, for an opportunity like that to come back, you got to cry a lot, you got to beg a lot, you got to really, read ziyarat a lot. I mean, it takes a lot to bring back an opportunity like that. So we have to be real careful in letting these opportunities slip away. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Segueing Sheikh Nurudeen into another topic, and I think this is a really important one, and time is kind of it's wrapping up for the night. But one of the interesting things that I was just kind of thinking about brainstorming is we've been really successful in terms of converting non-Muslims to Islam. I mean, and I say that again. There's a few points that I want to mention. Is that it's not really through any effort of ours, but we see that in America, for example, there's a lot of people who are converting to the religion of Islam. At the same time, the question is why not more people? That we're living in this country that literally has this religious vacuum. Why is it that we haven't been more successful? That we're still this really small minority population in the country, and in spite of the little efforts here and there, it hasn't really caught on. And so one of the questions and one of the issues that I wanted to explore a little bit is the question of, is it possible that we haven't been able to really be successful in terms of converting a large population, here in the US, because the type of identity that we have as Muslims is more of an ethnic identity rather than an Islamic identity. When you look at the situation, that when a person is looking at Islam in America, he's looking at the Muslims in America, is he seeing a religion that's designed for people in the Middle East, or is he seeing a religion that's a universal religion that they can follow and they can practice as well? What's your take on this? And
I
also,
think,
what can we
yeah,
do to just add this on? What can we do to fix this issue?
I think that you've hit the nail right on the head. Um, when when we look at our efforts in tabligh, in proselytization, and spreading the religion, I mean, we do little or nothing. I mean, even our Sunni brothers do way more than we do, and even their efforts, fall short of what is possible, right? And through no effort, as you said, through no effort of our own, Islam is the fastest growing religion in America, and growing exceptionally fast, like amongst Latinos, in these different little groups that you would never think of. Everybody knows that it's growing fast in prison, right? But it's fastest growing amongst women.
Mm.
Women in America are converting to Islam faster than men. I mean, it's just interesting, right? And we can get into that like in another discussion, like why are women converting so much? Why are Latinos converting? What's going on there, right? But given this high conversion rate through no efforts of our own, but why couldn't it be more? And I think it goes right back to what we were talking about, is identity. And I'm gonna specify a little bit. You mentioned a global, a universal brotherhood of Islam, that identity that we can bring that can fit in here and the people will come to it. I'm going to specify a little bit more. I agree with you that the approach that we've taken to doing tabligh and spreading Islam in America has been an Eastern approach, right? Very legalistic, very dogmatic, very dry, very shallow. And we have to remember that. And I'm not like being an exceptionalist or anything, but we have to realize that we're dealing with a highly technologically advanced society, highly literate, right? Even though they don't like to read right now, right? This is something recent, but these are well-educated people, but there is a spiritual vacuum, as you mentioned, that exists in the country. I feel personally that our cultural approach is wrong. We're not presenting a culturally relevant, to use the terminology that we're talking about tonight, we're not using, portraying an Islam that the people can identify with. Huh? And this is really, in my view, what's holding us back. I mean, just as an example, it's taken us almost 20 years to change from our own mother tongues to English in the masajid. You know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, English was the exception. 20 years later now, English is by and large the rule, right? And foreign languages plays second fiddle to English in most centers, right? It took us 20 years to get here. It took us a generation to get here. So we're still not presenting the religion and not packaging the religion appropriately for our audience. And that is a cultural weakness and an identity weakness that we're facing. We don't identify with the people that we're preaching to. I mean, I was sitting at a meeting of ulama a few years back, and they were talking about spreading religion, doing tablighat in the prisons. And they asked me what my opinion was of that. And I said, it's a wonderful thing. It's a very good thing that you're doing. May Allah bless you all for doing this work. But you should look at the back end of it too. When these people come out of prison, they're going to need those services. They're going to, naturally, because you introduce them to Islam, they're going to want to come to your center. Okay? Is your community ready for an influx of ex-cons? That too, black ex-cons, or Hispanic ex-cons. These people are going to need housing. They're going to need work. And they're going to be looking for a Muslim spouse. Are we prepared for that? Are we ready for that? And we're not, because we're still in our little cultural enclaves. And I'm not saying invite every ex-con in and give him your daughter, right? But at the same time, what I am saying is that we are not even anywhere prepared culturally. In this discussion, when I brought this up, the ulama who were there, and some of our most learned ulama in the country, and they said, we can't penetrate the people culturally. We can teach fiqh, and we can teach aqaid, and we can teach akhlaq, and we can give speeches, but that cultural penetration, it's out of our, we can't do it. We're not from here. We can't do it. And that's what we're lacking.
One of the interesting things that I think a lot of people don't realize is that when the Holy Prophet was preaching Islam, he packaged Islam in a very unique way. We kind of think of Islam as this monolithic type of thing where the cultural expressions are the Middle Eastern expressions. And when we look back at the time of the Prophet, right, he takes some things which are, from the Quran, from the Ahadith, but he combines it with a lot of the culture which was practiced in the Arabian Peninsula. Right, so he takes these two things and he combines it together. And so I think a lot of times we don't realize this. We think that Islam as a whole is, for example, the Islam that is practiced in Iran, or it is practiced in Iraq, or it is practiced in, for example, the Indo-Pak areas, without realizing that, no, those, there's the core values of Islam, but you also have those, the flavor essentially, right? The way that something is expressed. When we do, for example, Azadari, the way that Muharram, we mourn for Imam Hussein, a lot of these are cultural manifestations.
Mm-hmm.
And so just like you have that, for example, Indo-Pak or that Iranian or that Arab, you can also have the potential of having an American version of that, which is just as valid as any of those.
Yes, it
Yeah.
is just as valid. And I think that this is really what we're talking about, is that we have a misconception of Islamic culture as this one thing.
Mm,
Like it's this one universal global thing. Whereas that's not the case at all. There are numerous Islamic cultures. And so you have an Islamic culture that exists in Asia, one in South Asia. You have a whole nother one that exists in the Middle East, a completely different one that exists in Islamic countries in Europe,
mm,
you know. And there is a duty upon us to build one here. And I don't think a lot of people really take value in that work. Like, we're pioneers. Today I was speaking to a scholar in Iran on WhatsApp, and he was, like many of our foreign brothers, he was like, oh, how can you live in Florida? I've heard that, there's so much, indecent dressing there because it's hot. And I was like, yeah, but we're used to it, you know. And he was like, oh, I hate it and I could never live there. And this type of approach to me is like, bro, this is the place to live.
mm.
Like, this is where the struggle is. This is where the hardship is. There, the ladies are mandated to wear hijab. So I don't have to look down quite as much. I don't have to control myself quite as much.
Mm.
Here, I have to fight every day. And
Yeah.
some days it's a harder fight than others, right? To fight our inner self in any variety of things, you know? Um, so I think that we have to realize that we're pioneers. We're building something here. And this identity that we're building, it's not just what's in the best interest of our children, right? But it's what's in the best interest of the world. Because this Western culture is a global phenomenon now.
Mm,
And if we can build an Islamic culture, an Islamic identity in the West, like I said in the beginning, it's like vaccinating the rest of the world against Taghut. Like if we could come with a Taghut vaccine, you know, way better than but Taghut kills way more people than Corona.
mm.
And we are working on the Taghut vaccine here. We're in human trials. We will lose people, right? But at the other end of this, there will be a vaccine, and it will be in the identity and in the culture that we build here, inshallah.
Inshallah, inshallah. And with that, Sheikh, I think our time is coming to an end. I wanted to slowly wrap it up, but we had a couple questions and a couple comments. I
Yeah,
just wanted
let's
to
do
get,
some
yeah,
questions.
yeah, let's go through these. Brother Mateen, he actually mentioned a really good point. He said in the US, it's not just valid. We were talking about that, that American Islam, right? That version of Islam. He said it's not just valid, it's actually more valid, right? Because it is actually the reality of how Islam should be or could be practiced in America, right? That maybe the other versions are not going to be as effective, right? With those cultural manifestations that in that particular way. So that's a really interesting point. Another brother he mentions above. Let me just quickly scroll up so I can see this. Yeah, another brother, basically, he was mentioning the negative sides of American culture. He said, look, American culture has a lot of negatives. That um, he mentions that some of the negative cultures in America, disrespect of elders, over medicating, overbearing schedules, where being busy is actually something which is promoted. Um, so, he was asking in regards to that. And then the second part of the question is, he says, you mentioned that some immigrant parents are afraid of American values. Can we see what the reverse would be? For example, non-religious immigrant parents raising their kids here, I guess, as, white Americans or as Americans, what kind of a schizophrenia would these kids have, if any?
Hmm. I've never really given much thought to the mental state of someone like that. But you know what? When you look at it, I don't know if it would produce the same quote unquote schizophrenia. I
Mm,
think it would be more likely to produce a low self-esteem, like a low view of oneself. Um, I'll just give an example right quick, right? I can see it in some of our children when I go to the different centers, whose parents speak Farsi or Urdu or Arabic, but they don't. Even though they're Americans and their English is flawless, they still feel like a little less than
Mm.
because their language skills aren't on par, right? Um, Imagine if we're trying to deny a piece of ourselves. If we grow up seeing our parents acting as if they're ashamed of who they are, what does that make us feel about ourselves?
Mm.
Like, like I think it's much better to grow up in a household where my parents speak their language at home, and practice their traditions and their culture at home, rather than at home you actively see your parents trying to evade who they are. I think that wouldn't create that schizophrenia or that battle. It would create a taslim, like a surrender. Not even a surrender, like a submission. Not even a subjugation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's more of a danger there, as far as that's concerned, in my view.
Right. Sheikh, another question that comes in, and this is an interesting question as well. It's saying that what would you say to those who think that America itself is a mistake, meaning that it's not limited to just these moral issues that we see, for example, homosexuality, abortion, but rather to an inherent problem of how the nation was created, essentially the foundation of the nation. And she mentions that this would be consistent with the stance of some scholars, which is a wholesale rejection of the American identity and not just a rejection of this or that element of American culture. What would you have to say about this?
Um, I'm not willing to accept that point of view.
Mhm.
Yes, I'm not going to disagree. The founding of the country was, for lack of a better word, illegal. For all intents and purposes, we came, wiped out the original inhabitants, stole their land through trickery and thievery, and then imported a whole nother nation of people and enslaved them, right? And did so for hundreds of years. So there's no doubt that the foundation of the country is founded on, a very Taghuti system.
Mm.
Huh? Um, However, and this goes back to my worldview. I'm not going to say I'm a scholar. I'm not passing a fatwa here. It's just the reality of the world that I see. I personally feel that America has purpose. What has been built in America, this global domination that they've carried out and that they now exercise, right? And that is now also slipping and falling. Realize their actual control will fall long before their cultural influence does. It is my belief that because of this global influence, we as Muslims living here in the West are in a unique position that through this cultural
Mhm.
influence and the culture that we share with them to spread Islam to the rest of the world, right? This whole hadith that they talk about, the sun rising in the West. So that's all wrapped up in my mind with that. So I'm not willing to accept like the whole old school thought that we should reject America wholesale. Reject all American values. Yani, in effect, reject ourselves. And so then what? Do hijrat and leave here and go somewhere else? In my mind, there's too much blood under the bridge to do that.
Yeah. Sheikh, there's an interesting point. I think, we can be clear about this, that every culture is going to have certain positive and negative aspects. And I think when we're looking at how nations were founded, it goes without saying that most nations were founded on batil. Like, it's not, it wasn't this benign takeover that came and said, hey, we're gonna take a vote. Should we come? Should we not come? Every single nation, including, if you look at the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, every single nation was taken through domination. So obviously we reject that. That's not an Islamic aspect. That's not a just way of doing things. But within that, we're looking at the cultural manifestations of any nation that you live in, the values of any nation that you live in. And Islam is very simple. I think we can have a very simple approach. We look and we take what is good and is in line with Islam, and we reject whatever is not in line with Islam. And we have to do this really, it's not just we have to do it as Americans, we would have to do it as people who live in any nation. That if I was, for example, an Iraqi or Iranian, I would have to do the same thing. I can't just look and say everything that is done here is in line with Islam. No, some of it is going to be good, some of it is going to be bad. And as Muslims, that's essentially the duty that we have here.
I think that we have to completely open ourselves up, using just Islam and aql as our guides, then balance ourselves and be open to build something new. We cannot use the old format is completely useless to us. Like a lot of times, for instance, we don't recognize that it's perfectly okay to live in a secular state. Like none of us have, it seems like none of us have read the Constitution of Medina when Prophet wrote the first Constitution of Medina, when there were Muslims and Jews, and it's okay. It's like we have this idea that Islam must come and conquer, and we have to, raise the alam over the White House. It's perfectly okay to live in a secular state and everybody have their own rights. And Islam accepts this also. Like we have to break the old format, like break away from that old format completely and be open to build something new. It's not overnight work.
Yeah.
Like for instance, when we look at, as an example, Iran, that we know today as a predominantly Shia country, right? It wasn't like that when the Safawiya first showed up. How long ago was that? It's really not that long ago, and so if we were to just use that as an example, it's taken 500 years for Iran to get to where they are culturally, like Islamically, as far as Tashayyo, not even Islamically, but as far as Tashayyo, right? On an official level. It's going to take us a few generations to build this thing that we're talking about. It's not overnight work. We are building this not for ourselves, not even for our children in mind. Yes, it's for our children, but we're thinking about our children and our great-grandchildren. This is generational work. Yeah.
All right, Shaykh. I think we're going to have to end it here. It's already way beyond our time. We're actually 10 minutes over our time. I just wanted to, again, thank you so much for your time. I know you guys are so much for rushing up over actually midnight over there on the East Coast. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Send my salams to everyone.